You're listening to the CD Baby DIY Music Podcast. Hey there, this is episode 16 of the CD Baby DIY Musicians Podcast. My name is Kevin, and I'm the host of the show. And before we jump into everything, I just want to take a moment to welcome all our new listeners. Some of you old-time listeners who've been with us since the beginning may not have known, but the podcast was featured on the homepage of the podcast section in iTunes last week. So a whole bunch of new folks have stumbled across the show and given it a listen. So just wanted to say welcome. We're just trying to create a community of indie musicians. So outside of the podcast, we also have a website, cdbabypodcast.com, where we try to pack in a bunch of resources that can help your career outside of just what we discuss on the podcast itself. And also, feel free to drop us a line. Let us know what you're thinking of the show so far. You can reach us at info@cdbabypodcast.com. We love getting your feedback. And a lot of the shows that we put together are based on questions or comments we see reoccurring, or a listener just sending in a show idea like, hey, you guys do this show. And we do it. So feel free to email us at any time. Well, that being said, let's move on with the show. On today's podcast, we're going to be talking about record labels. And specifically, we're going to be talking to Dylan Magierek of Badman Recording Co, an indie label based here in Portland, Oregon. And I know some of you might be thinking, why would a DIY podcast, a do-it-yourself podcast, be interested in talking to a record label? Well, have you ever stopped to think how often the topic of record labels and record companies comes up in musician circles? For the new artists starting out, it's I need to find a label. I need to find a label to help me get my music to the next level. For the more established artist, it's usually something along the lines of, I hate my record label. They don't do anything for me. And then moving on to the more seasoned pro, it's usually something along the lines of, stay away from record labels. A stern warning to those who have not experienced the woes. But it still keeps coming up. So we thought we would use the podcast to help bring some clarity to the issue. I mean, what's a record label even supposed to do? What is their function? I mean, do we even need record labels? We asked Dylan all those questions and more, and I think you might be surprised by some of his answers. So let's hear what he has to say. Well, Dylan, thanks for being on the podcast.
Sure.
I know you're running a record company now, but I'm always curious as to how people get their start in the music industry. How did you get your start?
I guess I started out as a musician first, back in the 80s, and then worked for retail. Later, I worked at Tower Records, and that really taught me a lot about distribution and the different record labels. I really got into that. I thought that was all kind of fascinating, the business side of it. And I would record bands occasionally too, just on 4-track. That's about all we had back then. I moved to San Francisco with a band in 1989 and played with them for a little while, played in a few other bands, and just always enjoyed recording the bands and kind of getting into making demos and stuff. And then I started working for a major record distributor called Universal. Then they have Interscope and Geffen and MCA at the time, and I really enjoyed that and got into the sales and marketing of it. And at some point was just like, I wonder if I could do something with this. You know, I know how to get the records in the stores. So maybe I'll try and find a band I like and record them and see if I can put their records in Tower on consignment or something. And that ended up working out for this group called the Cherries. We made a great, 8-track recording at my house, and everybody was really happy with it. And I started with them, and then about a year later, put out a compilation that did really well with groups like Red House Painters and Low, Hayden, a few others, and then people were interested in the label all of a sudden. And I just kind of took it from there.
How did you end up in Portland?
I came to Portland about a year ago. I would visit here for trips for Universal because I had some accounts up here that I started calling on later on, and I just always loved it here. Just just good vibes here in Portland. And I got married about 2 years ago, and I kept telling my wife, we should move up to Portland. I really think it'd be great. She'd never been up here, and we came up for a wedding, and she loved it. And we started looking for a house right away, and then we had a kid and moved up here when the kid was about 9 months old, and it's been a good time.
Well, cool. We're glad to have you in Portland. But let's move on to what we're going to talk about, and just you as a label owner, owning an indie label, Badman Recordings. And honestly, some people listening to the podcast may not understand exactly what a record label really does. I think the general perception among up-and-coming artists is that the label are the ones who make you famous.
Or don't make you famous and you're pissed.
Yeah, so I thought it would be good if you describe the role and function of a record label.
Okay. Well, I think there's a number of people have different perspectives on it. But I guess my feelings are that a record label should enable an artist to get their music out to more people and try to promote that artist as best they can with the finances and resources they have to people. So in our case, I'm a big believer in hiring a publicist. A publicist goes after press, tries to get physical press and blog press these days for an artist. They do press around tours, which is very important. And I like doing a little bit of radio, college airplay, little mailings out to college radio. And I believe a lot in doing some advertising and promotion at retail. So trying to get listening stations for bands especially, I think, is important. I like the idea of someone being able to walk into a record store, having never heard a band before, put on some headphones, and suddenly find their new favorite band. Mm-hmm. And it happened because, we spent $100 to get a band on a listening station for a month. So I think that it's very important for a band to go out and do all the things that they need to do on their own. I think it's great if a band puts out their first record themselves, gets used to how hard it is to do it on your own, so they can appreciate when other people are working for them and trying to help them. I think a band really needs to go out and tour and be involved with the record label quite a bit. There's often a lot of pressure on a record label to make a band or an artist famous or popular. And I think that it's really a shared responsibility with the band. And when things don't go as well as the band initially expected, I think that the label tends to be the one who's blamed.
What things don't fall under the label's list of responsibilities? I hear it all the time where artists are complaining or saying, I thought the label was going to do this thing for me, and they didn't.
Right. Take out full-page ads and, Magnet, Rolling Stone, Spin, Years ago, I had one artist in particular that really expected us to spend a lot of money. And their feeling was it's catch-22. If you don't get our name out there like crazy, people aren't going to know of the band. And my take on it was, it doesn't make any sense to spend $1,000 on a quarter-page ad in a magazine if you guys aren't getting out there and working hard and letting people find you while you're touring. Mm-hmm. It's we got to build to a certain point, and then we can lift up off of that. Mm-hmm. So I think bands don't really understand that sometimes.
From your perspective running an indie label, what is different about an indie label and how you do business as opposed to a major label? I know you mentioned that you worked for Universal for a while.
Right. I've got a number of interesting stories, I feel like, on Universal. This might be a side note here, but I was thinking about it yesterday as I went through my piles of old CDs and I was looking at all my promos I'd gotten from Universal. And I felt like one of the sad things that happens on a major label is they tend to work on a lot more artists. So they tend to put out like I remember the Geffen days when I was working distributing Geffen. You know, they put out 20 to 30 records a year. Well, a lot of those records, if they didn't get airplay on that record at the big station down in LA right before the record came out, then that record was dead in the water before it ever hit the street. Mm-hmm. So I think what happens with a lot of major labels is they give up on something early if it doesn't look like it's going to do the big numbers, if it's really going to take off. You know, they have a lot of projects they're working on. They've got a limited amount of people to you know, work on those, and they need to, you know, focus their attention on just the big guns. Where I think in indie, you got to focus all your attention on every release, mm-hmm. and give every release your a full shot.
You mentioned the label offering access to things like a publicist and obviously distribution. So now that indie bands can do a lot of that on their own, where do you think the point is where an artist needs to decide, okay, we can no longer keep this up on our own, we need the help of a label?
Well, I kind of, you know, it's interesting that you bring that topic up, because that is a tough topic, the whole idea of an artist running their own label and kind of cutting the middleman out, in a sense, cutting the label out, or a label, you know, like how are they versing each other, you know? And I think that if an artist or a band is good with business, can kind of separate business and music at times and represent themselves as well as a good label would, and can think about the financial part of it and who to hire and gets kind of the right team together, I think an artist is great just doing the things themselves. You know, if they're smart about, you know, what distributor to work with, if they cover all their bases and can make it work, that's fantastic. But I think it's difficult to do that. Even these days, I think it's still a new territory, I think, for some artists. And I think where a label can really help, a good label, is they've already got those experiences with, well, this publicist I think would be the right person for your album because they like your style of music, or they're used to, we had good success on this band and you're kind of similar to that band. Or, you know, like the label can take a lot of the legwork out of it. They've already done the trial and error, you know, so many times, and can really save money, save time, get the ball rolling really quickly. But a lot of artists, I think, you know, it takes them a long time to make a record. They suddenly get 1,000 CDs and they are, you know, a little dumbfounded on what to do. I think in luckily, you know, places like CD Baby, which I've been loving for years and I'm happy to be doing some work for now, you know, they're a great place. People know about CD Baby now, and they know they could get all their digital covered on that, and they know they can, you know, have a great presence. People can find them that would have never even heard of the band before, but because CD Baby has that function of, well, if you like this, you might like that, they can sell CDs that way, you know. And now that someone like CD Baby, once again, has a deal with Super D, the one stop, they can, you know, get records into retail stores, possibly too, to some degree, if there's a need, if those record stores are asking for that record. So I guess if an artist feels like they can really take on the business end of it and do well at that, and really does their research and maybe hires a consultant or asks a lot of questions, I think that they can do a good job with it, possibly as well or possibly better than a label can.
Does it seem like artists are now getting better deals from record companies because artists and bands are now a little more savvy and now have less dependency on a label to get their music out, as opposed to what it was like 10 to 15 years ago?
Yeah, I do. I think now you get people with a track record. I mean, think of someone like, what's that band? I didn't care for them too much, but they were from Minneapolis, got really popular.
Semisonic.
No, I like Semisonic. I like those guys. I was kind of hoping they'd come back around. I like that book the drummer wrote. Yeah, and I was working on that record at the time when they were on MCA. So one of the scenes he's talking about, I was there, you know, and I was thinking of that their whole situation and what was happening at the time when their single was starting to blow up. And you know, when you're working for a big distributor, you see all this money being spent from the labels, and you know that the band. I mean, that was the unfortunate thing that you know, working in distribution is I got to see, I realized the bands had no idea what was happening on the label side of things. They just kind of knew like how their tour was going and sort of what sales were. but to see the inside of everything and seeing how much money was being spent and the lunches that were happening and getting charged back to them and all these things, it's pretty difficult. It's nice with an indie label that you really have to put that stuff up front to the band. They really have to know about that stuff right from the start, and it's a better checks and balances.
Yeah.
But I'm totally off your question, I'm sure.
That's okay. You were talking about a band from Minneapolis.
Oh yeah. What was that group? Well, shoot. They sound like people are saying they sound like Talking Heads.
Oh, Clap Your Hands.
Yeah, and not Clap Your Hands. Say yeah, but the other band that happened at the same time. I know it's one of those.
No, clap.
It's just like it was like the other guy that was doing really well, like Clap Your Hands. Say yeah, that had done it on their own, and we're just sound like crazy, and it makes all the labels come out and want you. It's the same old story, and. In the case of Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah, what's great about that is I think they kept it themselves the whole time. I don't think they ever gave things over to a label at all. And I don't know who they used for distribution, but they did a great job at just letting it be a word of mouth thing. I mean, that's the best way to sell anything probably, is just when people just keep talking about it and you go out and buy it. You don't need any advertising for that. But it is nice when you can get that sort of thing on your own as much as possible, because then people see that you have a buzz, people are interested in you, you have a sales history. I mean, these days, I think it's really difficult for a label to take a chance on a band. Unless you're an upstart label, you don't really have much going on, you need to build up a roster. Generally, I know in my case, I'd love to see a band that's already sold a few thousand copies on their own, or has had a few records out, they have a fan base. It's just so risky these days. You're spending, say, $10,000 per record to properly promote it and get it out there in the U.S. And, if you're getting a wholesale of $6 per CD sold, you need to sell a few thousand just to break even,
Can you explain that with a little more detail? I know that there's a lot of people out there who haven't worked with a label yet, younger musicians or so on, that think the store charges $15 for a CD and the label gets $15. But since you've worked in distribution and really seen how that process works, can you explain how the flow of money works from the store to the label to the artist?
Yeah. Well, basically a record label decides what they want their list price to be for the record. And I think a common list price is $15, $15.98. That's kind of the highest I'll go as a label. Say one of our bands like The Innocence Mission or Hayden, who's kind of one of our better selling artists. I'll go as high as that. What that $15.98 will basically mean for the label is about half that price is what we'll get paid into our pocket from our distributor. The distributor will probably make, so say we're getting $7, $7.50 a disc on a $15.98 list. The distributor will make about $2-3 on top of that. Mm-hmm. So they're basically selling it to record stores for around $10 or $11. So the record store makes that extra difference between $11 and $16, $15.98. So if a record label is making, say, $7 to $7.50 a disc, it sounds like a lot. But when you're spending, in a case like that, say The Innocence Mission, I might spend $30,000 just in manufacturing, promotion, publicity, and advertising costs. So if I'm putting $30,000 out there, at say $7 a pop, I gotta sell 5,000 CDs for the band and ourselves to start making any money. So it's a pretty big risk. CDs aren't just, I never think of a promo CD as being worth $1. A CD is worth all the costs involved with it, not just the manufacturing costs. Yeah. And that's where I think a lot of people got off base when they'd say, well, this is only costing $1. Why am I paying $16 for it? It's like there's all these other costs involved, and the label's really only making half or less than what you're seeing it priced at.
How many bands do you have on your roster right now?
I'd say probably 15 or so, and I think a total of that are active, I guess, and then probably 50 releases.
For the albums that you're actively working on, and the people that you're signing from this point on, do you have a typical recording budget that you go by?
Well, that's an interesting question because there was a time when I would record a lot of the bands that were going to be on our label. And I'm partners in a studio here called Type Foundry. I was partners in a studio in San Francisco called Closer Recording. And back then I was doing a lot more recording of the band. So I could keep the budgets down pretty low. I wouldn't charge anything for my time. I'd get a cut rate on the studio time for being a partner. So, you could make a good record for $2,000, $3,000, I would say. And these days, it's really changed because most of the bands we're putting out now record the records on their own at home. I've hardly recorded any records in the last couple of years, I think, that I've put out myself. And bands aren't usually going into a studio like they used to and spending all that money. It helps things a lot having that money come way down, like people having the equipment and doing a good job on their own at home, and then maybe taking it to a studio to mix it to get a little bigger sound, spending just a few $1,000s mixing it. Because the lower that budget, just the easier it is for everybody to recoup their costs as we sell just a few thousand copies, hopefully. But also these days, I have not generally been paying a recording advance to any artists. That's thrown in as part of the risk of all the money we're going to put in. So if I'm committing to a $10,000 budget for manufacturing, publicists, advertising, then what they spend on their record making it, they're throwing in as, to try and level the playing field. I generally am giving a 50% profit after our expenses on everything. So I feel like it's sort of a partnership.
Can you contrast the kind of record deals you offer bands being an indie label to what an artist might expect from a major label record deal?
I think these days it's pretty common for indies to do a 50-50 deal with the band, and that's basically the label saying that once our expenses are all paid back, that you'll get 50% of any profit. I don't think major labels are doing that. I bet there isn't one major label doing that sort of deal. They tend to do what works out. It's really interesting because I've looked at a lot of contracts and read a number of books, but a major label generally might come to you and say, we're going to give you 25% deal, and you're like, well, a quarter of everything. Plus, they're going to spend a lot of money, trying to get us on the radio and this and that. They're going to really invest in our career. Well, what are all the other deductions, though? Is there a packaging deduction? Packaging deduction is one of the most ridiculous deductions I've ever heard of. It's basically saying that we're going to take 25% off of your royalties based on, the packaging of your CD or LP. And it's like, what are you talking about? Why is my CD going to cost any more than $1 or 75 cents or whatever to make, And it's like, it's just a way to make it look big on the beginning and then start taking money off. Plus there's, return reserves, and there might be advertising reserves. There might be some other items where suddenly that 25% goes down to about 15 or 12%. So, if there is out of every dollar, you're making 12 cents, So it can be pretty tough. I prefer the 50-50 method. I think it's way more upfront.
In your 50-50 deal, do you keep record royalties separate from publishing money?
That's a really good question. It depends. The way we do it generally is, I own a publishing company also called Extra Gravy, and I offer a publishing deal to any of our artists that are interested in it, and most accept it. And I think the reason is if you do a publishing deal with us, and it's really a co-publishing deal, so it's as far as songwriting goes, you get 75% of any money earned, and we take 25% of it. Oh, great! Thanks for saying that. So instead of the normal 50-50 on that end, and what I promise out of that is I'm going to work harder at trying to get your songs placed in TV shows and commercials and films, and I will seek out other opportunities, where a lot of labels, they wouldn't mess with that because there are things like MTV. MTV doesn't pay the record company any money generally for letting one of the Real World or any of those shows, you know, the Hills, use a song. So they have no real interest in sending them a disc, in a sense. But on the publishing side, they have to pay money. Those shows still have to pay money. So being a publisher, I can, you know, say, you know, boom, here's discs, you know, for your show, and that can really add up to some real money. We had one of our artists on the Real World in a key spot. You know, some family member had just died, and he's going to the airport, and here's this song, you know, it's this classic Real World, and then here's this song that plays over the end credits, and people were going crazy trying to figure out whose song that was, and we ended up selling a bunch of digital downloads because of it, and made, I think, about $2,000 in publishing money just from that episode airing so many times. It was such a prime episode. Yeah. So anyway, I'm going a little off base here, you know. Good. But yeah, so generally in record deals, publishing is a separate entity, and we treat it as such also, but we do offer it as a, you know, if you want to add this on as an option, you know, we'd love to help you with your publishing.
So for an artist that says no thanks to the publishing deal, you're just going to split all of the money from record sales, and just, will you be less inclined to seek out opportunities as far as song placements go for that album?
A little less. They won't be on the absolute A list, because those people that I have a publishing deal with, I know that they're ready for anything. They might not want it in an Exxon commercial, you know, possibly, you know, if it's something that they don't truly believe in. If it, you know, if it's anything that looks a little risque in that way, that I'm going to say to them, hey, how do you feel about this? You know, but generally I've got the green light from them. So any quick opportunity I see that I think is all right, and I think they're going to think is all right, I'll go for. Whereas I have other artists, so I don't have publishing deals, that are a little more particular about that stuff, and it takes time. And sometimes when you're going to take time to get through it and find out all the information they need, you miss out on those opportunities. Yeah. So it's nice to have the publishing deal with people, because I think it makes more things happen. And those have been our busiest artists as far as getting placements and stuff.
What exactly are you looking for in a band? If you're thinking that you'll probably sign another artist in this upcoming quarter, what do you start looking for?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see. Well, I have a few different styles that I like, and so I tend to lean towards those. And I like to look around for people. I'm constantly looking. So I'm talking to people, and who do they like, and who have you heard that's sounding good, or people are really interested in. You know, I'm kind of looking, you know, to be serious about it, I am looking for some sort of sales history. I am looking for a sound that I really like. I have signed maybe one band in the past where I wasn't completely sold on their sound, but they came to me through a manager that I liked and believed in, and it looked like a lot of good things were happening for the band. They really wanted to work hard. They are good songwriters, and I took a chance on that, and it worked out pretty well. But I ended up not putting out their next record as a result. The next record, I really didn't care for the record. So, you know, the love for music needs to be there. The band has to be hard working. You know, this a new group that I'm about to sign called John Wineland. You know, one of the great things about them is they work so hard, and they are able to keep the band flush by just playing gigs. All the recording costs are covered by them playing gigs and playing out. And they play a lot of gigs. They do well, and they write great songs, you know, and they're excited and they're easygoing. You know, I really need a band that's easy to work with. I hate to say, but I've let go of some bands just because they were so difficult, you know.
How were they difficult?
We're opening this up, aren't we? Let me crack another beer. Just kidding. Well, there was that band, and that, you know, wanted kind of the world, and, you know, wanted me to spend a lot of money on advertising that I didn't think made sense, was constantly just kind of battling with me. I think a few of our artists feel, or have felt, I should say, because if they're gone now, that they need to push the label to make things happen. And I'm just one of those guys that doesn't react really that well to that. I feel like I'm a real go-getter as it is, really try not to put out too many releases at once so I can focus on each one well. I feel like I generally put together a pretty good game plan for the band right from the start. I keep them informed of what's going on. I feel like I'm a good communicator. So if a band is kind of on my ass a lot and pushing me for things that aren't really realistic, and, you know, maybe not showing that they're thankful for some of the things that are happening, then I start getting a little, you know, uneasy about them.
I think most artists tend to forget that it's a 50-50 relationship. The label is just not in it for the artist. The people working at the label, especially an indie label, are trying to pay their bills as well and make a living, and everything doesn't just revolve around the artist, even though we'd like it to.
It's true, and you know, that's such an interesting point that you're bringing up, because a few of our artists, when I talk to them, the conversation is completely about their career. And I understand that to a certain degree, but it makes me wonder if that's how their conversations are with everyone, you know. And it's really nice to separate yourself from your career sometimes and just try to let that go, because I think if you're worrying about it all the time or think about it all the time, it might not go that well. You know, you got to kind of let it live on its own a little bit, breathe.
I was curious to see if you could give us some specifics. You mentioned that you were looking at a band's sales history and playing a certain amount of shows. What are some of the hard numbers or key things that might grab your attention for a band to show up on your radar and you to start taking an interest in what they're doing?
If it's a local band and they've sold, you know, at least 1,000 of their CD, I think that's a pretty nice number. If people are buying them every time they, you know, if someone's selling at least 10 CDs a show, I'd say something's going on, you know, every time they play. I mean, that's a pretty nice number to me. I hear bands selling a whole lot more than that. But I think once you hit about 10 a show, you know, you're really affecting people that are going to see you. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, you know, that's just a mental number I have. It might not mean something to anybody else, but based on talking to a lot of our bands and what they tend to sell at shows, I see who's doing well, and I ask, and I kind of find out how people are reacting, and you see those numbers getting up around there when somebody's got something, you know, that's affecting people.
Are you normally expecting to see them playing a certain number of times?
Yeah, another good question. I've just recently started including in some of our agreements that there needs to be a minimum of 15 shows a year, in the first year at least, to support their record. And I started making it a contractual agreement, not to necessarily like, okay, you're in trouble if you don't do this, but just to make sure it's in writing what the expectations are. You know, because the agreement has a lot of other things about what the business expectations are and kind of the realm of things, you know, what's going to be spent and how it's divvied up and so forth. So I kind of felt like it just should be on the table that, you know, touring is so important. We feel that you should be playing at least, you know, a dozen or so shows a year. I'm not going to hold somebody down if I'm going to talk to them and stuff, but I wouldn't, you know, contractually hurt somebody if they only played those in the state, you know, or something. You know, that's the whole thing. Is your career benefits and your records benefit from you getting out there and supporting them. So, you know, it's in your best interest to get out and do those things.
Do you ever do just like a regional release, like you would sign someone here in Portland and then just promote their record to the Northwest?
I don't do that. I really believe in I think Badman, over the years, from, you know, the reaction from people, it seems to have enough of an international presence based on probably the artists we've had, and maybe we've become known for having, I like to think we've become known for having really quality artists, even if it's a slightly different genre from some other stuff we've put out, that it's good in that genre. Mm-hmm. So I think that some people tend to buy every release we have, you know. I mean, I see some of the website orders, you know, you can't track retail orders much, but, you know, because that's happening, I don't think that we should limit ourselves to a regional basis. Mm-hmm. I think that we should focus on a region if the band is mostly known there. I love focusing on the West Coast because I just see most, you know, my favorite record stores are on the West Coast. You know, Sonic Boom, Twist and Shout, Amoeba, you know, Music Millennium. Those guys all, you know, sell some of the most records. They do listening stations, and they're in all the key towns, you know, the key cities on the West Coast. And to me, touring the West Coast, you can hit so many big cities that make sense, that are supported by great retailers and radio stations, in almost a straight line right down. I don't feel like you can do the same in the Southwest or on the East Coast. So we will do that. We will focus sometimes on a number of, like the West Coast a little more, but the albums are available nationally. We go for national press. We go for national radio.
As an indie label, you obviously don't have the marketing muscle that the major labels do. Is there something that you guys are doing specifically that seems to be getting good results?
I would say, you really got to think about the guerrilla marketing of it, You really have to get in there and do trades with retailers, and you can usually do that through a distributor, but instead of paying $100 for a listening station at Lou's record store down in San Diego for a month of placement on the listening station, hey, will you guys, what does that equal in trade? Well, we pay $9 each for them, so that's 11 CDs. You can give us 11 CDs, and we'll put it on a listening station a month. It's like, okay, I'd rather do that than give you $100, because, maybe what those actually cost me with all my costs is only, $4 or something. So you can do some things like that. And I told someone that a few weeks ago. I said, hey, I know nobody's putting out your record, but, your last record sold well in these stores. Why don't you call them up and see if they'll do the trade thing with you? And he called up a couple stores, and right away they're like, oh, yeah, the Red Thread, I remember your records. Yeah, I like them. Yeah, you want to do a trade for your new side project? Great, yeah, send us 10 CDs, You go out and you do those sort of things. Consignment is a great way to get your records into stores without distribution. Just if you have to go to the used CD buyer and be like, hey, we're a local band or we're touring through this market, will you buy 3 of our CDs at $6 each? They're probably going to say yeah, Is radio even something worth considering for the average indie artist? I think that it's worth mailing your CD to radio stations. If you have time to follow up on it, do that. I think hiring a promoter to work on radio for you, generally, for me, and for Badman over the years, I think it's mostly been a waste of money, so I don't do that much of it. But I make sure that all the non-commercial stations that are important, and there's about 150 of them, they include KEXP and KCRW, WXPN in Philly. Those are important stations to make sure that all the key DJs have your CD, at least in their hands. You don't have to push it on them, but maybe you put a sticker on the front that says, such and such about this band, and we're touring through your market on this date. Hey, check out tracks 1 and 3 first, or something like that, and then have your email address. It's a little something that gives them a little rundown about you. It's a real quick. People don't have much time, Make sure the CD doesn't have its shrink wrap on it. Make sure you got that little info sticker on it, and at least put it in their hands. It's not costing you that much outside of postage and the manufacturing of them. And, make sure key stations have them. That's what I do about radio. And then, if it's an artist we have that's playing in Seattle, I might try to work out an in-store, on-air performance with someone like KEXP, or try and do something like that in Portland or, the key cities. If they've listened to your CD and like it, and if they start spinning it, they might have you on the air. So that's something that doesn't cost you anything.
Is there some place that people can go to get a pretty good list of all those stations?
Those lists tend to be like what you're paying money for. Yeah. So I got my list from a radio promoter, and it's one I've been loving and working off of for a while now. What you could do is you could hire a radio promotion person for one record, perhaps, if you can keep your costs down, and maybe do a limited amount of stations. Just tell them, hey, I want to do the top 100 core college stations out there, and I'll do the mailing for you, and they're going to probably say fine, and they're going to send you labels. And then just photocopy all those labels, and now you've got a list. You can do that.
Earlier you mentioned that you're really looking for a band that is going to be out and playing and touring to support the record. Do you help out artists with tour support in any way?
In the past, we had a booking agent that I worked closely with and would turn that person on to any new bands we had coming up, and she was good for a while and took on most of those bands that we had that didn't have a booking agent. So I did have that going on for a while, and that kind of fizzled out, and I haven't tried to pick that up again. I do try to support the bands in giving them CDs on the road at no charge. They're recoupable, so if they ever make money, if we ever cover all our expenses, then they pay a certain amount per disc. But it's easy for them, I think, to sell CDs at their shows generally, and then pocket that money for a while, and to help them with their expenses as far as that goes. Booking agents generally, it's up to them to go out and find those. I think booking, for me, that's the toughest part of this whole situation, is finding a good booking agent and then having them be able to get you good gigs when you're a kind of an upstart band. I think that's kind of a frustrating area for bands, booking people, sometimes labels.
Yep. I agree.
Meet me in Leon near Mexico City, where I remember you clear. Meet me at night, St. Louis, Missouri, where I first saw you.
Well, that's going to conclude another edition of the DIY Musician Podcast. We really appreciate Dylan for taking time out of his day to talk to us. All the music in this episode is by artists that are on his label. So if you're really liking what you're hearing, you can actually get a bunch of free download MP3s from the record company's website, and that is badmanrecordingco.com. So go grab some free music and maybe discover a new artist, and you can buy the full-length albums, a lot of them at cdbaby.com. And lastly, I just want to remind you to check out the podcast website, cdbabypodcast.com, and drop us a line, say hello, and we'll catch you next time.
Chase me down Sycamore like you did not long before. Play your old brown guitar and shine so bright.
You've been listening to the CD Baby DIY Music Podcast, broadcasting from Portland, Oregon, USA.
The